The average person is said to spend 15 minutes in the bathroom. Why not take advantage of that time and learn something new? Presenting the 15-minute podcast on weird facts, crazy details, and funny particulars that you'll be able to enjoy while you're taking a on your free time. Welcome to The Shit with Sam Butler. Welcome to another episode of The Shit Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Butler. It's a pleasure being with you all today. I want to thank you for joining me on the podcast, whether you're listening to it on platforms for podcasts or you're watching us on YouTube. I appreciate it. If you like the content, please don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the notifications. We do have a very special episode for you guys today, which I want to do in honor of women. Last week, we had the International Women's Day. That was on March the 8th, and we know that that is a big deal internationally. And, of course, in the United States, it's not as observed as it is in other countries. I work a lot in Mexico. I'm very familiar with Mexico and a lot of Latin American countries. And it's a big deal in these countries because there's still a lot of abuse towards women. There's a lot of feminicide. Women are being murdered or they're being abused. And so all this has to stop, you know. And so the only way that this stops is creating awareness for it. And women went out and protested in the streets. They made it was a big deal. And it's something that's important. It's a life and death situation. So in honor of women, I decided to do this episode of The Shit Podcast. Thank you for joining me. And I'd like to talk about some influential women throughout history. And of course, some anatomical details that are weird facts about women. So with that, let's get started. It was interesting to me to find out that the very first doctor in history that was a woman in recorded history wasn't in 1885 or 1785 or even 1600s. The first woman doctor was discovered to be in 2700 BC. Yeah, that's right, 2700 BC. She was an Egyptian. Her name was Merit Ptah, and she was arguably the first woman scientist in recorded history as well. So 2700 BC. That is a long time ago. So we'd like to bring out that weird fact. Maybe you didn't know, maybe you did, but the very first woman in space was the Russian Valentina Tereshkova. She was the first woman to be in space, and she accomplished this in 1963. Yeah, the first country to recognize the woman's right to vote and to grant women the right to vote was not the United States. It wasn't Great Britain. It was actually New Zealand. And that happened in 1893. So in 1893, we had the first country that gave women the right to vote. And of course, I think the United States wasn't much. Women's suffrage, I think, was like shortly after that, early 1900s. So the rest of the world kind of came along with them. So women's right to vote was 1893. There's an interesting fact about life expectancy. It says that women are expected to live longer than men. And we see that that's the case. I mean, you see a lot of the memes and stuff on social media where guys have a ladder against a ladder, a couple of buddies holding a ladder up for another guy. And so we as guys do a lot of dumb things. So it's interesting to know that women have a longer life expectancy. I want to talk about some women that are featured here. I mean, some of the most important women in history. The first woman that I came across that I read an article about was Marie Curie. Now, Marie Curie, her name was Maria Salomea Sklodowska Curie, and she was known as Marie Curie. She was actually born in 1867 and died in 1934. Now, a lot of you may already know because she is a very famous person in history, but she actually was key in discovering the elements of radioactive radioactivity, and radiology and so on and so forth. She was also one of the first women. She was actually the first person to get 2 Nobel Peace Prizes, one for physics and the other one for chemistry. And she was the first woman to occupy the role of a professor at the University of Paris. Marie Curie did all these things, but in addition to those things, she was a mother. So she had 2 daughters, and she had to share her time between her studies and her teaching with raising her kids. So we see that women really can do a lot. The next person that I would like to highlight a little bit is somebody that I didn't have any clue was revolutionary towards the world. And this woman did a lot for the world. And I would have never, if you had asked me, hey, Sam, who do you think is an example of life-changing woman in history, I would have never guessed that it was Coco Chanel. Coco Chanel lived in 1883. That was when she was born, and she died in 1971. Coco Chanel, though, her design, her influence, her fashion really changed the world, because prior to that, women were still wearing corsets. They were still dressing like in the Belle Epoque, which is the golden age of history. And so you can imagine women wearing these big, bulky dresses, these corsets, and trying to get around and doing things. Well, Coco Chanel made not dressing like that fashionable, which influenced how women dress today and how different things are able to be done today. So for that, I'm really impressed, and I think it's the shit that she changed the world. And some of the things that you would imagine is like fashion not being that important. Well, it was important when you stop and consider the changes that had to happen. I want to talk about Rosalind Franklin. Now, Rosalind Franklin lived from 1920 to 1958. What was special about her? Well, she was a pioneer in discovering DNA, and in doing so, was the first person that was able to actually photograph DNA. And she has that famous photo 51, where it's part B of the DNA chain. And of course, the sad part is that she wasn't acknowledged for this. On the contrary, it was in 1962 when 3 men were actually awarded the Nobel Prize in physiology and medicine for discovering DNA. Ironically, she had discovered it 10 years previous to that. So they were awarded in 1962. So we know that she discovered this around 1951, 52, and never really received recognition for it. And it's because of her discovery that we're actually able to use DNA now, and we're able to understand DNA. Another young lady that revolutionized the world was Malala Yosai. Yeah, she was a Pakistani girl that really opened the eyes to the world about how women and young women were not being allowed to be educated in Pakistan. And she actually received the Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts and in education for young women. And her story, her life story, was something that granted her that award. But she was also able to keep fighting for the right to education. And we take that for granted in our countries, that women can go to school, can go to study, but it was a big deal. The Taliban was totally against it. And as a result, the 9th of October in 2012, they tried to assassinate her. Luckily, she survived, and she's still active in pursuing education for young women in Pakistan. The next woman that I would love to highlight is Elizabeth Blackwell. Now, Elizabeth Blackwell lived in 1821 and died in 1910. And she was the first woman that was enrolled at the School of Medicine in Geneva. And she's also the first U.S. citizen to actually get a diploma and be recognized as a doctor. So she was not only was she a pioneer in medicine, she was also the first woman doctor. And of course, she defended education. She defended the right for women to an education, and she defended abolition, in which, of course, we know that that's the fight against slavery. So from 1949 till today, we know that there's the Elizabeth Blackwell Prize, which recognizes the women that have contributed to medicine and that have just been notable as doctors. So with that, we recognize Elizabeth Blackwell. Now, this next woman that I think was it was super interesting to me, because we're going to talk about Donna Strickland. You might not know who Donna Strickland is. And of course, when I was doing the research for this episode, I was looking for women that maybe weren't on the tip of the tongue. There's a lot of women that were incredible and pioneers. We can talk about Rosa Parks, Anne Frank, but a lot of those stories you guys already know. What I wanted to do was find those stories that we didn't know, or you might take for granted. And of course, Donna Strickland is one of those stories. Now, she was able to find a way to create light and frequency, which developed the first lasers. And those are the type of lasers that are being used today. I'm a perfect example of it, because I had LASIK about 5-6 years ago. So she was the first one to discover how to create that. And it's the basis of those lasers that are used in surgical operations, as well as laser surgery. And this was she was born in 1959. In 1985, she published an article that described the technique, which is described as chirped pulse amplification. And it wasn't until 30 years later that she actually got the Nobel Prize in Physics. And she became the first woman in the 21st century to receive the Nobel Prize. The next woman that I would like to highlight is Hedy Lamarr. Now, Hedy Lamarr is a very interesting case, because you probably never heard of her. But she was an actress. She was born in 1914 and died in the year 2000. Now, what's interesting about her is that in addition to being an actress, she was also a scientist. And she developed the theory of wide spectrum, which is the precursor to Wi-Fi. And she did this during the Second World War. So she developed a communication system that would allow connectivity with torpedoes that could be controlled by radio signals from certain bases. So she was able to encrypt these signals, and we're talking Second World War. And it was her discoveries and her technology that has actually allowed us to develop GPS and the Wi-Fi, which is something that, for a lot of us, that's modern history. There was no Wi-Fi there was no Wi-Fi 12 years ago, maybe. 15 years, maybe 10, 12 years since Wi-Fi has become a thing. We were all connected to Ethernet cables. Well, Hedy Lamarr came up with this during World War II, and that's very, very interesting. And now we're going to wrap it up with just some weird facts about women and their anatomy. One of the weird facts that I found was that the woman's heart beats 8 times more per minute. And this is due to the fact that it's slightly smaller. Most women are slightly smaller than men, and therefore their heart is also slightly smaller than men. And to make up the difference, it actually beats 8 times faster per minute, which I thought was a pretty interesting and weird fact. It also explains why they love you more. One One of the things that I thought was interesting is that a lot of women love chocolate, right? I mean, that's one of the things. It's like they love chocolate. Well, that makes a lot of sense. Some studies discovered that women can taste sweetness more, and that's because they have more taste buds that determine sweetness. And so they actually have a larger amount of taste buds in comparison to men that are the sweet receptors. So that makes a lot of sense why they like sweetness. And the last and final detail here that I found, a weird fact that I found, is, and this is something that happens to me. A friend of mine and I talk about how his wife always can smell everything. I mean, women can smell everything. If you haven't washed your pants in 3 days, a woman can pick up on it. My mom, when I was a kid, my buddies and I, we went out and smoked some cigarettes in the morning, and thinking we're all slick and we're all grown up and we're smoking, and we get home from school, my mom could smell the cigarette on me after school. And she's like, "Have you been smoking? I know you've been smoking. I can smell it." And I mean, I'm talking about like 6 hours later, my mom knew I had been smoking. So women actually, it was found out that women actually do have a more developed sense of smell. A study done on Plus One magazine did the study with 7 men and 11 women, everybody over 55 years old, and they found out that women have, on average, 43% more smell receptors in their cranium, which is interesting. I'm not don't know too much about that, but whatever it is that we smell with, they've got 43% more. That's what I'm trying to say. And to me, that makes a lot of sense. So guys, shower up, wear deodorant, get some good smelling lotion, because it's not fair to women that we walk around smelling like goats. With that being said, that wraps up this episode of the Shit Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you guys for joining me. Please like and subscribe. And add me on your social media as Tu Amigo Sam. And with that, we wrap this up. I want to thank everybody that supported the podcast this week. I was hacked. My Facebook got hacked. And I want to thank Los Cagadienses, which is my official Facebook group, for all of the memes and all of the... I mean, as soon as I got hacked, I was being notified through all my social media that something was wrong with my account. And then everybody pitched in and let everybody else know that there was a problem, not to believe the hack, because the hacker was going around asking for money in my name. And I'm sorry if you fell for anything or if it affected your social media, but I want to thank all of the followers and the fans for coming through. And then, of course, once it was determined that I was able to get my account back, all of the memes started flooding in, and they're hilarious. And so if you want to take a look at them on my social media. They're on my Instagram, my Facebook, and they're all memes that fans did. So I want to thank you guys for joining us, and that's it for this episode of the Shit Podcast.